My name is Professor Alan Haywood. I'm from the School of Earth and Environment here at the University of Leeds. I'm a climate scientist, and I'm also the Pro-Dean for Research and Innovation for our Faculty of Environment. I also have the pleasure of chairing the University of Leeds Responsible Research Metrics Working Group, which I'll come back to in a moment or two. So today we're very fortunate to have as our speaker Professor Stephen Curry from Imperial College London and the Department of Life Sciences down there. Stephen is a prize-winning structural biologist of over 30 years experience, and as well as publishing very widely in the field of structural biology, he's also focused a lot of his time and attention on wider considerations of issues around conducting research in the research community, research assessment and the dissemination of research. And I think specifically we can point to two clear areas of focus and endeavor around open research. Stephen is very passionate about open research and also about improving our approaches to research assessment, which is what we're going to hear about today. Stephen's a very authoritative, has a great authority in this area. He is the chair of the Declaration on Research Assessment, which some of you may also know as the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. And DORA's vision is to advance practical and robust approaches to research assessment globally and across all scholarly disciplines. So University of Leeds is a signatory to DORA, and we have our own Responsible Research Metrics Working Group, and we're mapping the connections between the principles outlined in DORA and the structures of our own structures and processes of our own organization. We're reviewing our current policies to ensure compliance, suggesting alternatives and alterations to processes where they may be needed. But we also aim to be a source of valuable information to try to help widen the participation in this area and to help people understand and enact the kind of principles of DORA on a day-to-day basis. So before we get into the talk, just as a bit of meeting etiquette, I guess, if you're not asking a question, then could you please make sure you keep your camera and your audio off so we don't get any feedback or bandwidth issues. And when we come to the question and answer session, can you please post your question in the chat, or at least say that you have a question in the chat, and that will help us field those appropriately and efficiently to Stephen, because Stephen's very keen to answer your questions. So without further ado, may I welcome and thank Professor Stephen Curry for joining us today. And we are really looking forward to your talk, which is entitled Responsible Research Assessment, Rethinking What We Value in Research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that very kind introduction. I might take some issue with your characterization of myself as an authority, but the question of authority is something that I hope to return to at the end of my talk. But it's a great pleasure to be talking to you today and to be virtually in Leeds. I would much prefer to be actually in Leeds, but hopefully in a few months or maybe even weeks, then more normal service will be resumed. I do feel quite a strong connection with Leeds. My brother lives in the city, but also I have already been to the university to talk about my structural biology in the past, and have some friends and colleagues working in the structural biology department there. And of course, your relatively new Vice Chancellor, Professor Budendijk, is a former colleague of mine and someone whom I worked with very closely at Imperial on a number of issues which did actually touch on research assessment. So what I want to do today, and I am going to endeavor to keep to time and finish by 1/4 to the hour so that we can have some time for discussion, is to give, first of all, just a few personal reflections or give my personal perspective on the nature of the problem and why we need to think, why we need to rethink research assessment. I want to tell you a little bit about what DORA is doing. I know that Leeds has signed it. I'm very pleased to see that. But I know also from talking to many people at universities around the country and around the world that knowledge about DORA isn't nearly as deep or wide as we as an organization would like. And we're working very hard on that. And we are doing a lot of what I hope is interesting and valuable work to advance this agenda. And then finally, I hope to sort of open up a couple of questions that maybe presage the discussion that we will have. I'm pleased to hear that, at Leeds, clearly you've been discussing what signing DORA means for you as an institution. And I understand that, institutions and individual academics are sometimes not necessarily blindsided, but obviously there are challenges that come with any change. And if there are new standards or new goals or objectives or incentives in play, then it's really important that we develop a shared understanding of what those are. And rethinking research assessment is a complex and messy business, and nobody, not least DORA, has all of the answers or a mature set of ready-made solutions. We operate in a very complex environment, subject to many different internal and external pressures. And I think if we are going to make real change, we do need to sort of unpick those and understand them and develop, as far as we are able, among a bunch of academics, develop some sort of consensus way forward. So that's where I hope to get to. So just to try and set the scene, as Alan mentioned, I have been sort of working and thinking in this space for quite some time. And one of the major issues that actually drew me into the sort of discussions around open science and around research assessment, because they are very closely interlinked, is the disconnect, I think, that has begun to emerge or has emerged over the past couple of decades between the internal incentives within the academy and the sort of societal value and broader value of the work that we do as academics. Many people come into a research career motivated by the most noblest goals. They want to understand the world. They want to change it for the better through their research. And one of the areas where that happens, I think, most obviously is in the area of medical research. And this article, which I wrote a few years ago, highlights an issue that is still very current, which arose when Zika virus was sort of spreading around the world, and there was evidence that it was potentially linked to a rise in microcephaly in newborn babies in South America. And in order to stimulate research on that, the Wellcome Trust led a coalition of funders and publishers to give researchers the permission to share their results as quickly as possible, as preprints, as raw data, and gave them then the promise that they would not be penalized by journals down the line when they came to submit their manuscripts for peer review, because of the sort of overriding impression that the Ingelfinger rule applied, and that if there was a preprint already on the internet, then the journal would consider the paper already published and wouldn't consider it. And it was really striking to me that in order to have to because Wellcome actually doing that was illustrative of the fact that there's a fundamental problem in the standards that we have allowed to come into play or to dictate the way that we communicate our results. We submit to significant delays in many cases. It's easily several months even if you get accepted with minor revisions, but it can be a year or two or more in order to get published, ideally, of course, in the journal that you want. And of course, we all know that academics are motivated by career incentives to publish in the best journals, and that's obviously linked to impact factors and other indicators of reputation in different ways. And yet that does a disservice to the public interest. And the public interest in healthcare is fairly obvious. And the public interest as a taxpayer, because most of university-based research is publicly funded, there is, to my mind, a sort of natural justice in ensuring that they have, not only that they have access to it, but that they can see that the research community is doing its very best to share its results so that new findings can be rapidly built upon, because that's where the value is maximized and the return on public spending is greatest. So we have, we saw an uptake in preprints, and we've certainly seen that significantly in the COVID pandemic, where there's been a very sharp rise in the sharing of results. We can talk about preprints in the Q&A. Obviously, there are potential downsides because it's not peer reviewed. On balance, my view is that the benefits vastly outweigh the risks, and the risks can be mitigated. But there was an interesting piece which I noticed in Science this morning, looking at the impact that preprints had and suggesting that, which was one of my fears, is that post-pandemic, we will simply revert to business as usual. And I think I would certainly like to prevent that as far as possible, because I am interested. I think it's healthy for the research ecosystem to be attuned to the public interest more broadly. And it also is an important mechanism whereby I hope we can maintain the trust of the public. I think the scientific community has generally had a good pandemic, if I can use such a brutal euphemism. I think people have seen the value, very particularly in the UK, through epidemiological modelling, through vaccine development. The contribution of the scientific community has been enormously appreciated, and we don't want to squander that. Just one other example in a completely different field. This is a tweet about a video by Robert Insell, who led the National Institute for Mental Health in the United States for 13 years. When I look back, he says, I realized, well, I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, 20 billion. I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, or improving recovery for millions of people who have mental illness. And so we have, through our incentive system, generated a disconnect between the public interest and the activities that scientists are rewarded for. And I hope that can be widely recognized. In thinking about this, I've been very much influenced by the writings of Michael Sandel, who's a Harvard philosopher, and I would recommend this lecture to you, which he gave at the end of 2018. Now, here he's talking about the political landscape, and he's talking specifically about the vote for Brexit and the vote for Donald Trump to become president of the United States, which he traces to the sort of, neoliberal marketized status quo that has come to settle on America and Western Europe, where market value is the way that governments seek to organize their policies and the way that society is organized. And this has led to massive disenfranchisement. And I think we can perhaps all agree that that is one of the root causes of the decision to dissociate ourselves from the European Union. Many people felt democratically sidelined. They didn't see what the European Union had done for them. They had no voice. They were given no value. And we have many people working in this country because of the way that market forces work, who are on very low wages and don't really see a future for them. And there is a reaction to that. Now, that's a political story. Sandel's proposed solution is about framing politics around genuine appreciation and social recognition for contributions to the common life and to collective well-being. And through the pandemic, I think we've seen that there's been enormous recognition of the value of the work that people in the social care system do, something that's been in the news rate of late. And yet, these are people who are on minimum wages, and yet they are caring for our nearest and dearest in a most important phase of their life. But our society doesn't place tremendous value on that, and yet it is an extraordinarily valuable job and activity. So we need to think how we go beyond how the market rewards us and how the market defines the value of our contribution. And that neoliberal consensus, of course, has found its way into the academy. And so if we think about what are the market, what constitutes market value in academia, and increasingly, of course, we see that it's become metricized. And so journal impact factors and university rankings have become normalized. I'm not going to sort of give you chapter and verse on the deep flaws that I see in the methodologies for the calculation of these metrics, but university rankings, I increasingly come to see, cannot in any way, shape or form be considered to be responsible research metrics. They are deeply flawed and deeply problematic. DORA is concerned with rankings, but is more concerned with impact factors. But just to highlight a couple of the sort of main problems is that the obsession with journal metrics reduces productivity. And here again, it's working against the public interest, because the chase for impact factors slows publications. People submit to multiple cycles of submission and rejection in their sort of gradual descent down the impact factor hierarchy. And we see a positive bias in literature because journals are not incentivized to publish negative results or flashy results because it's in their commercial interests in many cases. And that applies even for non-profit journals because they generate important surpluses. And so that puts biases in the literature. In terms of the broader landscape, then, we operate, of course, in a competitive environment. And one of the Gordian knots that I really haven't found a way to unpick, but I think has increasingly come to the fore, is how do we prevent healthy competition becoming unhealthy hyper competition? And we have so far failed pretty badly in doing that. The focus on impact factors and papers devalues other important activities, real world impact, as we've just been discussing, but it also devalues academics because it doesn't properly recognize the rich variety of activities that they have to be involved in, such as teaching undergraduates, being a good departmental citizen, contributing to policy work, public engagement. There are many, many things that are not sufficiently well recognized in a system of incentives that's overly focused on journal impact factors. It very much focuses on the what, the product. It's largely, we place a lot of weight on publication in certain journals, place a lot of weight on grant income, for example, but it's not focusing on the how. How did this person get this fantastic result? Was it by treating their research group very badly? And who gets to be involved? And we need here issues of equality and diversity come into play, which I'll touch on later. We know there's a strong correlation between impact factors and lack of reproducibility, some of which is due to fraud. And that, and while it's still a small percentage, it's a growing problem, one that we're becoming increasingly aware of. And again, that can contribute to an undermining of public trust. And someone who's DORA has worked with increasingly and who's an academic who researches in this area is Professor Sarah de Rijke from the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and does sort of sociological research looking at the cultural effects of indicators in a much more systematic way, and concludes in a very interesting paper from 2017 that the focus on indicators displaces other norms and other criteria for quality. Okay, and I hope we would all agree that quality is important, and that can be characterized as epistemic originality, long-term progress, societal relevance, social responsibility. These become less attention in the minds of individual researchers with the growing focus on quantitative indicators. Okay, and this is in contrast with policy goals, which are sometimes influenced by government agendas, which is, I think, a reasonable thing to consider in an open and democratic society. But I have seen myself in talking to people, and these are actual genuine quotations from talking to people. I have anonymized them to protect the individuals involved, but talking to one faculty dean at a well-known university, our people know how to get the Nature papers. Not that our people know how to do research which is really driving forward their disciplines, which is changing the world. It's codified as Nature papers. And we, of course, we all know what that means, but I think it's a very dangerous mode of thinking to slip into. And of course, we all have slipped into it. And here's a postdoc, really excited, just had a big paper in Insell. That was the first thing they wanted to tell me. They didn't want to tell me the actual nature of the result, even though we both worked in the same field. So that is problematic, and there are other, as Dederick's work has shown, and many other studies have shown, there are impacts on research culture, and we have seen a growing attention paid to the sort of damaging effects of the sort of hyper competition that is at play in the academy. These are just a handful or a selection of recent reports from the Nuffield Council. This is one actually that Simone and I collaborated on as part of LERU. The Wellcome Trust, of course, has been a very important, I think, actor in this space, and even the Russell Group, the sort of self-selecting top universities of the UK, of which both Imperial and Leeds are members, is even now paying much more attention to the need to ensure a much more positive culture. And the culture is very much influenced by the things that we value. And we tend to value publications, and we are not doing a good enough job of valuing people. So this is DORA's conception of what a healthy set of research values would look like. It is a somewhat utopian view, but it's we would like to see more reliable, rapidly communicated, accessible, high-quality research that transforms our understanding of the world, can change it for the better. Researchers who collaborate, who feel a duty of care to group members and to the society of which they're a part. And a research system as a whole that values the people within it, cares about their quality of life, and seeks out the creative vigor of diversity. And I think we would all recognize that there are challenges for us on all those points. And the question for us, the question for DORA, is how do we actually realize this in practice? If we can agree, and hopefully we can, that this is a destination. So one of the things that I think is a really important part of this movement is placing an accent on open science. And open science means different things to different people. I think it's not something that can be sort of defined necessarily in a box, but I think there are examples that clearly are emerging that have met resistance in various quarters, but I think there is a strong argument to be made that open science can certainly be better science. So I am a big proponent of preprints. It's faster communication. It sort of solves the problem that the chase for journal impact has created. I like also there's a slightly subversive nature to preprints because it forces the reader to focus on the content rather than the container, i.e. the journal. And it has, as we've seen in a number of different forums, encourages open peer review. One sees more commentary underneath the preprints than one has seen when it's been tried out in journals. And actually, what we've seen during the COVID pandemic is very rapid dissections on social media, in many cases, or in blogs, of results that have come out. And in some cases where troubling results have been published in preprints, that either the data has been faked or has been badly misinterpreted, or a very poorly constructed study has been presented as a reliable piece of research, it has been very rapidly deconstructed by open peer review. Open access generally, I am a proponent of. Again, it provides a global audience, and I think the more eyeballs you have on a piece of work, the greater scrutiny, and that then will help to foster greater reliability. It's more difficult to implement in practice, which I think is why it has been lagging behind, although it's also been lagging behind in terms of policy development. But data and code sharing is, of course, a natural part and parcel, both of open access generally and, of course, of preprints, which is a particular form of open access. And again, that enables reuse, so you get better value for from the individual piece of research, and allows for greater scrutiny, and once again, should bolster reliability. And as we have seen with the Zika crisis and with the coronavirus crisis, open science is much better for changing the world. You can do it more rapidly. That said, there is still complexities in in moving in those directions. As we've seen, the debates around open access are still fairly torrid in some forums. They're not readily accepted, and there are disciplinary differences that I think have to be worked out. From DORA's point of view, we have thought about this, and I had realized actually, I give talks about DORA on a very regular basis around the country and around the world, and increasingly I've always found it difficult to talk about research assessment without then thinking about the links with open scholarship, and increasingly of late without then thinking about the links between the need to consider equity and inclusion within the academy. So these are three, I think, very large and important intersecting pieces. There is positive movement in all directions, but there are important intersections between them that we need to consider. And we wrote an article about this on the DORA blog last summer. But open scholarship, raises important questions around research assessment. There is traditionally a focus on outputs, but we want to think about the qualities and the varieties of the outputs if we are to do research assessment in a robust way. And open scholarship, it helps to foster the idea that it isn't just the paper that's important, but it's important to share the reagents and the methods. Make sure that the methods are genuinely written in a way that things are reproducible, but to share the data, to share the code that is associated with the work, as well as thinking then about all the other things and whether even a commitment to open science is an attribute of a researcher that we would seek to recognize and reward in our incentive structures. There are intersections with the drive towards equality, diversity, and inclusion. We recognize there is bias and injustice within the academy. The academy is not representative of the public at large, and that is partly due to biases that are at play during research assessment, because we see there's greater diversity and inclusion actually at the bottom end of the academic career ladder. But if Imperial is anything to go by, we see that often gets filtered out. So we see a leaky pipeline for women, for example, for people from ethnic minorities, as one then looks to the more senior roles. And partly that is due to biases that are embedded in our research assessment practices. And so we obviously need to become more alive to them. And that is going to be healthy for the sort of broader aspect and the representation that one sees in the academy, because I think there is a really important question, and this is something that was actually first highlighted to me by Simone, was that if you really do have a diverse academy and you really are tapping into all the talent pools that are out there, then if your academy is more representative, then you're much more likely to be asking the questions that are going to have the most societal relevance and impact, because you will be taking the whole of society into account and their needs and wants and worries and priorities for the future. So this is, a nice simple diagram. It's obviously much more complicated than that. Behind that, I think one can then map out a kind of series of constraints, which mean that, actually moving in those directions and bringing these sort of three intersecting sets together to create a research culture that is focused, that is value-based, and that is focused on people. There are barriers that we need to identify and seek to overcome. And the ones that I would primarily identify are, the way that research is managed, both by government and funders. And, we do have a kind of market, competitive market and component. There is a desire for a return on investment, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. We don't want to waste money on bad research or bad science. I'm sure all the sort of senior management who may or may not be in attendance recognize the extraordinary financial and time pressures on universities. I think certainly every member of academic staff will recognize the time pressures that we're faced. And then there is this prevailing idea, the way that we validate or valorize researchers, this idea of the genius or the lone genius or the hero researcher, which tends to underplay the value of teams and the importance of contributions, not just from postdocs and PhD students, but from technical staff and indeed other support staff, librarians and research managers even, to the delivery of high quality research. And so, these factors create a toxic brew. There's, every time is pressed, but governments want universities to report on their performance. They will look at metrics. They will look at league tables. They will focus on products rather than on the less tangible benefits that arise from research. And there are genuine challenges around that. We have tensions between, freedom and accountability when it comes particularly to open science, and the arguments that we have heard around Plan S, for example, which is about to bite in the UK as of April next year. And then the sort of the barriers that come up around the culture, the pressure that people have to succeed, the idea that you're a researcher, there are people, we will all know anecdotes, who get away with extremely poor and toxic discriminatory behavior, bullying, because they are perceived as an asset to the university in some ways. And we do need to challenge that narrative as well. But there are no, as I said right at the beginning, there are no easy solutions to this. And we do have to think and come together as a community to figure out, what are the solutions to it. And DORA, I would very much like to think, is part of the solution and is helping very much to drive the conversation in the UK and worldwide on what responsible research assessment looks like. So just to tell you a little bit about DORA, it is best known, I think, for being down on the impact factor. So the primary recommendation in the declaration, and I would encourage you to read it, because I have had many arguments with people who have never read the declaration, and some of those needn't have happened if they had taken the time to do that. But it is best known for recommending that researchers and institutions and other stakeholders do not use journal-based metrics as a surrogate measure of the quality of individual research articles or individual researchers. But what's less well known is that in the rest of the declaration, there are actually 17 positive recommendations for different stakeholders. Just to cite the two that are noted for research institutions like universities, and it's about being explicit about the criteria that are used and focusing on the scientific content of a paper or the scholarly content, to give it a slightly wider framing. And then for the purposes of research assessment, to consider the value and impact of all research outputs. So don't focus just on the paper, but think of other contributions, data sets, software, and other impact measures, such as influence on policy and practice. And we have seen encouraging moves in that direction. And DORA is very much aiming to focus on that. To give you a very quick potted history, the initiative was launched in May of 2013, although the declaration was originally drafted at the very end of 2012. So we kind of have, like the Queen, we have two birthdays. Currently, there are over 18,000 individuals and 2,300 organizations that have signed. And I think in the first few years of DORA's existence, I remember I was not involved in the creation of the initiative, but I was given a preview of it and was a very strong supporter from the beginning. But I think in the first few years, because it was rooted or based in the American Society of Cell Biology and just based on their website, it didn't have the visibility or the punch or impact that many of us kind of hoped that it might have. And so there were a number of us got together in 2016, 2017, and managed to secure new financial support for the organization. And so we now have 2.2 full-time members of staff plus an intern, and two voluntary committees which are international, a steering group and an advisory board, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. This is our current support or member organizations. So these are organizations that give us money or service in kind in order to support the efforts that DORA has made. And so since 2016, we have been able to be much active thanks to that, even with just 2.2, and for actually it's only recently gone up to 2.2. For a long time it was 1.2. But with just that small group of group of staff and a much more dedicated steering group now. We have been much more active in recent years. So we have a steering committee which is largely derived from our member organizations. And one of the things we've done since 2017 is to very deliberately go out and make sure that we had an advisory board that had a truly global perspective. So I'm very proud that our advisory board has got representatives from all across the globe. We aim to try and get at least 3 members of the advisory board from each continent on the planet: North and South America, Africa, Australia, Asia, and Europe. And we are actually now looking to integrate we thought it was really important to have a global perspective on this, because research assessment reform is a global challenge. There's no point in trying to do it in just one institution or one country, because the challenges are universal, and there are interesting tensions that we have to resolve between the northern and southern hemisphere, for example. And we're currently reviewing our governance structure, and we are looking to create a mechanism that actually really fully integrates that global perspective into how we oversee things. So we set ourselves a brief roadmap: recruiting more signatories, because it increases the brand and the reach and the impact of the initiative. We look to extend the global and disciplinary impact of DORA. So the first step of that was creating the advisory board and being much more international in our activities and perspective. And DORA was very much born in the sort of molecular and cell biology sphere, but we recognize that the challenges extend throughout the academy. And I think it's often perceived as a scientific initiative, and certainly that is where it was born, but we are working hard to make sure that it has got full disciplinary coverage. And the final one is the one that we really have been working very hard on, is developing and promoting best practice in research assessment, not only working ourselves to develop new tools, but collaborating broadly. And just to give you, here's a couple of sort of briefing notes that we have created. One of the things that we have started doing since 2017 is either pitching up at scientific conferences to sort of ambush the audience, as it were, and run workshops to get them to think about, bias in research assessment, for example. We've also taken to running meetings of our own, and this is one that we ran jointly with HHMI in October 19 in the before times, which was to bring together institutional leaders to think about the barriers to research assessment reform within institutions, primarily within universities, which I think is the place where there is the greatest challenge, because that is where researchers are located, are employed, and are regularly evaluated. So that meeting is summarized in this paper, which was published last year, which also took the opportunity to do a survey of sort of good practice around the research landscape. And it did very much place an emphasis. Yeah, 5 minutes, that's fine. I will wrap up. So importantly, I think, put in place a framework for action, which was really about encouraging institutions to, if they are signing DORA, or if they are looking to reform their practice, to go about that in a systematic way, to think about, what the obstacles will be. Not to be afraid of experimenting with different approaches, because as I said at the beginning, this is a space where nobody has all the answers or all the solutions. And so we do want to encourage experimentation and evaluation, because there could, of course, be unintended effects that come about through innovations that are introduced, and then making sure that that is all done in dialogue with the research community at the institution in order to create, what is a truly shared vision. So we have long been sort of collecting examples of good practice, and we created a resource library, which is now, given the recent revamp of our website, much easier to search, and is demonstrating and hopefully helping to promote good practice around the world. I'm a great believer in that nothing succeeds like success. And I think, as we discussed at the beginning, often in this space, people and institutions are nervous about introducing change. But if you have seen that someone else has already been at least partway down that road and had a good outcome, then I'm sure that will encourage others. We collaborate extensively. We're a very small organization, as I said, just 2.2 staff. Everybody else is voluntary. So my work in DORA is done in my so-called spare time. We collaborated with the Royal Society in helping to develop the resume for researchers, because I think the narrative CV format, I mean, it's not a silver bullet necessarily, but it is a way of providing a structured narrative which can allow applicants or candidates for promotion or for jobs to better articulate, their particular contributions across a range of different activities. Not just their contributions to knowledge and research, but how do they support individuals in their team, or how do they support the wider research community or their discipline or society. There are a number of variants of this. The Charité University Hospital in Berlin has a focus on contributions to open science as a value that they want to promote. And so there are different ways to experiment with this. The Science Foundation Ireland has implemented a narrative CV in a slightly different format. And I noticed recently then UK funders have issued a joint statement where, as you may well be aware, UKRI has very recently committed to using a narrative CV format in its application processes, but they are getting together with national organizations. And actually, we're hoping that this work will even go international in trying to think about common standards, because if we develop too many different standards, then we're placing a workload burden on applicants. We've collaborated with Wellcome in helping develop their more recent open access policy, which now has a requirement that if you want to be funded by Wellcome, then you have to work at an institution that has either signed DORA or has manifestly made real moves to implement its principles. And this is a move, I think that, funders do have a very important role to play here. They are nervous, I think, sometimes about, dictating the pace to the research community, but there is a long-established principle that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And I think it is notable that funders do have some leverage here that I think, as long as they listen responsibly and responsively to the research community, can be an important driver of change. And that is happening on a more global scale. This is a working paper that we co-wrote in preparation for a meeting of the Global Research Council. And so that's helping to develop more joined-up thinking around research assessment across the world. One of the key resources that DORA has generated is our case studies. So these are examples of institutions that have already gone down the road, and these are now available to be shared. And then most recently, the things that we've done in developing new tools is this space rubric, which is a tool to help institutions think through where are we now in our journey towards reforming research assessment. What are the likely barriers and what are the opportunities for us in going down that? And it is also a tool then that can be used to help evaluate, the impact of any changes that you have made. And we recently also then got a grant from the Arcadia Foundation, and this is developing to help develop new tools to advance research assessment reform. So I'm pleased to see, of course, that Leeds is very much on that journey, and you have a statement on responsible metrics. I do like to think in this space of responsible research assessment, to think about it more broadly. Metrics are useful pieces of information, but I think we have to work very hard to make sure that we keep them in context. I note the Leeds statement seems eminently sensible to me. Metrics relating to research activities include bibliometrics, so citations, alt metrics, application award data, which we now see that research councils are generating, conference invitations, research income, postgraduate training. But we know from existing data that there are lots of biases within these in citation patterns. The productivity of women is impacted by family commitments and responsibilities, and that obviously has to be taken into account. Alt metrics are an interesting bit of information, but if one places too much weight on them, then you have to realize that it's quite possible to buy Twitter followers and to distort your alt metrics in a very simple and cynical way. And so, one has to take account of that. And just sort of finally, a couple of slides just to sort of open up and again, place draw attention to the fact that while I may be very enthusiastic and recognize the importance of research assessment reform and be looking to help DORA do that in a particular way, and to promote practices around open science, there is not a consensus around that. And this is an article on a recent sort of argument within the Netherlands, where actually the whole country and the whole university system is actually thinking very hard about new modes of research assessment. And Utrecht has placed a big emphasis on collaboration and open science, and that drew a rebuke from a bunch of professors who have a more conservative view, I would say. We're concerned that the new system will lead to randomness and a compromising of scientific quality, and they really did not want to let go of impact factors when push came to shove. Prof. Dederick responded to that, as did I, in the article. But I think, while I might be critical of my Dutch professorial colleagues, it's really important to listen and to hear the views, the concerns, the fears that are expressed, and to be able to engage in dialogue with them. And one other issue that has sort of embroiled DORA in recent months and involved quite a lot of my time is the situation that you may know of around a restructuring in the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences at Liverpool University, where DORA has been involved. There have been criticisms that the use of sort of citation metrics, the field-weighted citation index, and of grant income targets in selecting people at risk of redundancy has brought forth a torrent of criticism. Liverpool is a signatory of DORA. We have had conversations with them, and because we generally think that when reports emerge of possible breaches of the principles or the spirit of DORA, then we try to work with the institution that is signed in order to better understand the problem. And we have had confidential conversations, and that brings to light a more complex picture than is available in the public domain, but hopefully it can nevertheless stimulate course corrections, shall we say, because as I said earlier, experimentation and permission to experiment and permission to get things wrong has to be a part of the system. And then finally, I'm a great believer in the importance of dialogue. Here are two different perspectives on how you might go about changing the world. Bregman's book is really interesting. It asserts if you want to change the world, you've got to be unrealistic, unreasonable, and impossible. And certainly there are people debating in this space who adopt that attitude. I much prefer Gawande's approach. We do yearn for frictionless and technological solutions, but people talking to people is how standards change. And I hope now we can proceed to that phase of the meeting today. So thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for a very interesting and enjoyable, comprehensive talk. We'll just allow some of the questions to come into the chat for a moment, and I'll use Chair's prerogative to ask you one straight away, if I may. Many of us still have links from our websites to Web of Science, citation reports, Google Scholar, so on and so forth. I know both you and I have links on our web, or we have Google Scholar pages out there, which people can find easily on the web. And of course, those have a lot of the traditional type of information there, H-index, which has been heavily criticized, the I-10 index, so on and so forth. Do you think that any of those things are problematic in the context of sort of individual responsibility for meeting and trying to make progress in these areas?
Yes, I think potentially they are. One of my problems with Google Scholar is that it's a ready-made source of the H-index, and I think it's probably the one that most people would cite if they are talking about it, because it's typically slightly higher than the one that you can calculate from Web of Science, because I think it captures a broader range of citations. I did actually have conversations with Google a few years ago and saying that, on the H-index, please could you just create a link that prints the distribution of the citations that contribute to the H index, because it's a one-dimensional number capturing a highly complex set of activities and outputs and outcomes. And I haven't included it in this, but I have a slide showing my own, I did calculate it by hand, my own distribution, and showing that, you know, across all of my publications, I'm very proud of the ones at the top with the highest citations, but I've got publications which are preprints, which are the impact factor is 0, which I'm extremely proud of and which have had a significant impact. And I've even got papers that have not very many citations, for which, you know, there's a very interesting and important story result to tell. And so they didn't want to do that. Unfortunately, they said it would overcomplicate the interface. Although I note they have recently put on a display of the amount of open access publications that you have. The quality of the information on that, gather, is diabolical. So I don't know why they couldn't do one, not the other. But a H index for me is as problematic as impact factors, because you're aggregating complexity, and we really have to think about you know, the particulars, the individual piece of research and the individual researcher. And the law of averages is good when you're thinking about large bodies. Maybe if you're thinking about, you know, the citation performance on average in a department. But for an individual, it's not a good predictor.
Okay, yeah, that's accepted. Okay, let's go to the questions now. So there's a question from Caroline. So if I, as a young researcher, apply for a job at a place that is not a signatory, which places heavy importance on citation index, does DORA have any suggestions on how to navigate the interview and or convince the organization to change their culture?
That's a very good question, and it's one that I frequently encounter. I would always advise a young researcher is, you know, take a look at the real world as it is now, and not as we might all want it to be. And if you have got an organization that has not signed DORA, I wouldn't put it in as part of my application that, you know, I want to come here and then I want to transform the way you do research and assessment, because it's obviously rubbish. That probably wouldn't help you. I think, you know, you have your life, you get one shot at it, so you have to be a little bit selfish in thinking about, you know, what's important to you. I have certainly seen young researchers who are deeply committed to open research and want to put everything, want to publish preprints, want to put everything in open access. That's entirely laudable. I think it's incumbent on, you know, our generation, you and me, Alan. So, okay, we climbed up the greasy pole. We did it perhaps a little bit cynically. You know, I played the game with the best of them when I was a young researcher. It's my conversion and thinking about this is in the last 10 or 12 years. But I do think it's incumbent on our generation to mitigate the risks for early career researchers. And that is one of the reasons that I, you know, spend so much time doing this. I'd like to see more people take Randy Sheckman's approach. So when Sheckman, who's a celebrated cell biologist, when he won the Nobel Prize, on the day of the announcement, he announced that he would not publish in Cell, Nature, or Science because of the distorting impacts that the chase for that kind of prestige was having on the conduct of research. And I'd like to see more Nobel laureates and more fellows of the Royal Society take such a principled stand, because I think people like that, you know, they can support the younger people in their own labs, because, you know, obviously if you work in the lab of Randy Sheckman, he can write you a really good reference, and that will support your application for work. But I do appreciate the concerns of young researchers, but I have to say my general understanding is that they're much more prepared to embrace change than my senior colleagues from the Netherlands.
Thank you. Chris Little's got his hand up. Chris.
Hi, I've got loads of questions, but I'm thinking about just what would be the important one. The first thing to point out is at the very start of the chat, I pointed out that the current application form for Leeds for professorship states at least two things which are verboten in DORA. And some people pointed out that those criteria, which are faculty level criteria, will be looked at ASAP, and I hope they are looked at and got rid of, because they're totally incompatible with DORA. Explicitly talks about impact factors of the journals that you publish in. But a much more general question relates to where you see this going. What's the ultimate prize at the end of this? I'm certainly with you that impact factors of journals is a distorting factor, and it doesn't reflect the quality of the research. But it's quite tricky if you are not an expert in a particular field to judge the quality of a paper that's put in front of you. And people have put in the chat, how do you do that when you're looking at hundreds of CVs that lists tens of papers? So that's one issue. And the other thing is, you touched on this about the hero researcher, many of whom are truly brilliant and probably will move society forward in terms of science, but can often be extremely obstructive individuals. How do you then balance collegiality, making an organization work, and therefore the quality of life of everyone within that institution versus the hero scientist mold?
Okay, so so very briefly, okay, I'm not surprised that there is a document in Leeds that's maybe, in conflict with the spirit and commitment of the declaration. I would, I work at a large university myself. I know how complicated they are, and I know how often the communications fail internally. And signing DORA is about a journey of ensuring implementation. So I hope that'll be addressed with soon. Yeah, I mean, okay, no one is suggesting that you're going to have to read hundreds of papers of every applicant in order to make assessments. I do appreciate, and often academics were very, very nervous about straying outside our discipline and making assessments, which is why I think many have come to rely on the impact factor, because it seems like a ready-made, it seems like an objective signal of quality that we can rely on. But there are many dangers in relying on an aggregate metric. So the workload question is one of the reasons why I think that narrative CVs are helpful, because you then get the applicant to articulate it. And in the promotion forms at Imperial, for example, it says, tell us about your 4 best papers and why you think they are important. And so I think then getting them to articulate it in a concise form, and that of course is the point of the narrative CV, getting candidates to answer all the same questions. Again, it's qualitative information and it's not easy to assess, but let's face it, these are complex decisions that we are making, and it's important to do them well and in a fully informed fashion. So that narrative CV structure, I think, is one way of controlling the workload and still doing a reasonable job. One, of course, hopefully also relies on expert peer review sometimes. So if you are trying to judge papers outside your field, you are getting the benefit of experts within the discipline. That's one of the logistical ways around that. And then the hero researcher, you seem to be basically asking me, how do we compromise on, well, whether or not we let a superstar researcher off in terms of collegiality or behavior? And I have to say, I would say, do not compromise on behavior. Okay, we cannot let people get away with bullying, with sexual harassment. We know that it is a deep-seated problem not just within higher education, but it's widespread in universities. If you talk to your female colleagues, I think it's something like at least 50% of them will have had some experience of sexual harassment in their careers. And that is one of the factors that drives women out of the academy. So I would have to say that we do not compromise on that. And that if you have got a culture that values people, that fosters collegiality and collaboration, that will, I would argue, don't know how you're going to do the experiment, give you better research and better productivity in the long term.
Thank you. And I think just as a quick response, Chris, I assume you're referring to the faculty associated notes. And when the promotions panels restarted at the University of Leeds, that's something I spotted right away and have already communicated the requirement for that change to HR. So if that has not happened yet, it is in the process of happening right now.
It has not happened.
Actually, Chris's question also illustrates the value and the power of DORA, because it empowers staff to challenge it when they find a breach. And so it is joined up in that sense. So well done. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I do promise you, Chris, that was already in the works, and you have my word on that.
Thanks, Alan.
I just want to try and sneak in one more, if I can, from Kat. Policy change, e.g. promotion criteria, grant assessment criteria, is one necessary approach. But how about the slower, deeper change, i.e. the culture among rank and file researchers? Are we starting to see the traditional assessment approaches being called out on the ground, e.g. by panels, or hey, I got a cell paper being challenged as a badge of achievement? So Stephen, I think that's probably a kind of a question to you to kind of reflect on the degree to which you're kind of seeing the ground shift, you're sensing the ground shift, the degree to which it's kind of becoming embedded in the broader culture, not just the policies of the organizations.
I think I am seeing a shift. I would have to say it's not wholesale and it's not always consistent. But and certainly the quote that I had from my dean friend from a different university is still relatively typical, and so that and people do, there is a slippery argument about aggregate statistics, the impact factor. On average, a Nature paper is going to be more interesting than a paper in the British Journal of this or that. Okay. And that's true on average, but it isn't true in every case. And that's the point I always come back to, is that you really, if you are going to do a good job of this, then you do have to think about, that aspect, the particulars, and set the work in context. And so, I have seen, I am, certainly what I can and doing what I can to make the argument. I imagine Simone is doing much the same job at Leeds already, and hopefully calling people out. I was very gratified to see at a senior management meeting at my own university, our vice provost for research actually pulled somebody up for talking in rather loose terms about Nature papers, this or that, and said, well, hang on a minute, we've signed DORA, you can't say that, and so it does happen. That's anecdotal evidence, but culture change, and I work very deeply in the whole drive to thinking about how we improve equality, diversity, and inclusion at the university. Behavior change is a really long, slow business, and it is about challenging the status quo, and the status quo don't like to be challenged, okay? And so but one has to have articulate and reasoned and evidence-based ways to do it. But I think the case can certainly be made, and I hope, and I'm encouraged by the UKRI, for example, placing a greater emphasis on research culture, thinking about bullying and harassment. The Wellcome Trust has already put in place measures where they want to know about people that they fund that are being investigated for poor behavior. And I think because we've got to get to a position where we're not catching people out and getting rid of them for bad behavior, but we're fostering good behavior as the norm. But that will take time. Right. And it will never be perfect, of course. We're talking about human civilization here.
Yes, naturally imperfect. Thank you very much. I think we're definitely over on time, but there's been lots of interaction in the chat, plenty of things for us to think about. You've got us thinking, Stephen, which I think is continuing to think, which I think is the key thing.
It would actually be great if there was some sort of forum within the university. Maybe there is already, Alan, that you know of, about within the. Did you get me this time?
I did, yeah. Carry on.
This raises really interesting questions and lots of problems as well. And I would be absolutely fascinated if there was an ability to discuss this within the university, particularly as it sounds like policies are being made, and much as I trust the management to get this right, it would be very interesting to know how this is going to translate in the future. Because I think much of what I do, this impacts it on.
Yes.
In all sorts of ways.
No, I understand that completely, Chris. I mean, I think that's obviously one of the reasons why we wanted to have events like this, because it does enable us to come together. It does enable us to discuss these things, and of course, in terms of moving forward, then the changes to the policies, they have to go through the appropriate approvals, and that includes going to faculty research innovation committees, going to school research committees. But we are thinking about the broader comms associated with this, and ways to kind of ensure that we get the broadest possible feedback into it. So yeah, no, I understand that and agree. So with that, I think all I need to do is to say thank you. Thank you to you, Stephen. Thank you for the organisers who helped make this event happen today. And thank you for those with inside the organisation and outside who came to join us and make it so vibrant. So thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.